Welcome, everyone. I'm Maureen O'Connor, president of Palo Alto University. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's Wellness Book Talk. Palo Alto University is dedicated to addressing pressing and emerging issues in the fields of psychology and counseling that meet the needs of today's diverse society. I'm so pleased today to be speaking with author and PAU alumnus of our wonderful Psy.D consortium program, Dr. Jonah Paquette. I'm talking about his latest book, Awestruck, there it is, How the New Science of Awe Can Make Us Happier, Healthier, and More Connected. In addition to being an author, Dr. Paquette is a practicing psychologist and assistant regional director of mental health training at a large HMO in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's also authored the books Real Happiness and The Happiness Toolbox. So we couldn't have a better guide with us today to help us through these challenging times. Quick housekeeping item before we get started. Please use the Q&A feature to submit questions. They will be addressed toward the end of our conversations. Welcome, Jonah.
Thanks so much for having me. It's definitely a thrill as a proud alum of PAU to be doing this with you today.
Well, we're delighted to have you. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for writing this wonderful book. I've really enjoyed reading it and highly recommend it to those in our audience if you haven't had a chance yet.
It was a fun book to not only research, to experience, and to write about. So the time flew by, which nobody typically believes me when I say about writing a book, but it definitely was a lot of fun to do.
Is that how you felt about your dissertation too?
Not 100%, although nobody believes me on this. Because I did my dissertation on positive psychology, I felt like even though I had to put a lot of work into it, it was similarly a fun one to do relative to dissertations. You know, it's on a dissertation scale and a curve. But I think that's actually where I really got started with this interest on well-being and the science of happiness and all of these different. It was really towards the end of graduate school, as I was going into my dissertation, that launched me towards this aspect of the field, at least.
Oh, I love it. That's great. Well, since this is a book talk, I thought we could start off with a brief excerpt from the book.
Sure.
I love what you've done in the book is you've woven in some of your own experiences of awe to sort of help the reader to understand it. So perhaps you could start with that wonderful excerpt about you trekking through the
and even though I don't love to hear myself read, which is why the audiobook is with somebody else. I'm happy to but I'll just say, I think as I was becoming interested in this topic, it really was my own experiences actually that sparked my curiosity and made me think to myself, these moments of life that are magical and captivating, is there something there that's, beyond just feeling good in the moment? Do these moments and these experiences do something to us? Do they change us in some way? And it was actually one of those moments that I also describe in the book, not the one I'll write about, but we're in that exact moment in time was when I thought to myself, I wonder if anyone has actually written about this and done work on this. And that's what really launched me towards this topic. But I'll read just that brief excerpt from when I was fortunate enough to have the great experience of seeing Machu Picchu and doing a trek in Peru. All right, so after 5 days of trekking through the mountains, we finally reached our destination. The past few days had been filled with incredible beauty, snow-capped mountains, lush green valleys, and charming highland villages that seemed removed from the modern world entirely. But it had also been a challenge: altitude sickness, sore muscles and joints, frigid temperatures, and a struggle to keep my breath at our highest altitude. But it would all be worth it for this moment, the final day of our Cultivate trek in Peru. As our group reached the lookout point, we gazed down and were greeted by a sea of heavy fog. But as the minutes passed, the fog began to dissipate, revealing a hidden treasure that had been hiding in plain sight. Below us stood Machu Picchu in all of its glory. Discovered, air quotes, in 1911 by the explorer Hiram Bingham, It had gone undetected for hundreds of years following the collapse of the Incan Empire in the 16th century, shrouded away in the highlands of Peru. Once an administrative and religious center for the Incas, many of its structures remained perfectly intact, with strict quotas on visitors keeping Machu Picchu in a pristine state. As our guide explained some of the relevant history, I found myself transfixed by what I looked at below. Gazing down on this ancient site surrounded by green mountains, I found myself drawn in by its beauty, by its history, by its grandeur. It was as if time slowed down, and I felt a strange mix of calmness and excitement wash over me. In that moment, I was experiencing a profound moment of awe. We've all been there, but why do we feel it? And then I go into that.
I love that so much. So there you are, looking down, feeling this profound sense of awe.
Mhm.
And the inspiration you got was to sort of understand that more. I love that because I think that comes out of your training, right? You're trained to think about, not just the experience, but what underlies it. So talk a little bit about how those moments, not just that one, but others, sort of led you on this path.
So, as I started to think back about some of these flashbulb moments in my own life, and by the way, they weren't all quite as grand as visiting Machu Picchu. And I think that's actually, I'll say it at the outset, one of the real things I want to emphasize both today, but in the book is, we think of awe as being these 1 in a million moments, gazing out across the Grand Canyon, looking up at the sky on a perfect dark night. But I think just as importantly is looking for the wonder in the everyday, and turning the everyday, the mundane, into something much more profound. And it was this realization that, both on the grand scale, what I would call informally capital A awe moments, and on the much smaller, humbler moments of life, that these moments really, they affect us in a deep and lasting and profound way. And so obviously in the first half of the book, what I dive into a lot more, which I'm sure we'll get into, is, well, what do those moments do for us? Because I think before getting into that, my assumption was that awe was almost like the cherry on top of a good life sundae. It was, nice, but hardly essential. And if I've learned really anything over the last few years when it comes to awe, it's that the moments are anything but small and insignificant. They're deep and they're meaningful, and they can be life-changing even. When I go into what happens in the brain and the body in a state of awe, it's actually remarkably similar to what you see even in certain psychedelic states, which is an interesting part of the literature that's starting to come out. So it really affects us in this deep way, and it has an effect on our health, on our brain, on our immune system, on our relationships. So simply put, it is good for us, in addition to just being a pretty, I think, cool and interesting topic to explore.
Excellent. And well, and let's I love that I love that that's where you're, I feel proud as the PAU president that's where your thinking brought you, because I think that's what we're hoping, right? With our wonderful training, is that people think about the world that way. But let's step back for a minute and define awe. It's sort of like let's make sure we're all sort of on the same thinking about how you, or at least how you define it. So you define it as, you have other ways to describe it, but in one way you define it as the feeling that comes when we encounter something so vast or profound that we struggle to fully comprehend it. And that feeling has profound implications for many areas of our lives, as you were just suggesting. So what gives us a sense of awe? What is that?
Yeah, and I think if we look at how do we operationalize these experiences of awe, there's a lot of researchers who are in this space who are doing just incredible work. Dr. Keltner at UC Berkeley at Greater Good Science Center is one, and Lonnie Shioda, and there's many others who I rely heavily on in terms of their work. And some of the definitions have some subtleties and differences, but if you were to look kind of holistically at them, what we're seeing are these two interconnecting principles that put together create this experience of awe. And so the first is that we encounter something that's vast, something that's bigger than ourselves. That could be in the physical realm, like gazing up at the night sky, but it could also be in the idea realm, conceptual realm, you might say. So learning about ideas that are mind expanding, learning about topics that, challenge the way that we think. So vastness in one shape or form is that first part. And then the second is what's referred to in this literature as accommodation. In other words, it's almost like going back to those child development courses you might have taken in undergrad on Piaget, and you encounter something and your mental structures can't take it in, and you have to change the way that you look and change the way that you think, allow those in. And that, in a way, is basically what they're talking about there. So vastness plus accommodation is awe. But I think, informally, my shorthand is just, it's the moments in life that make us go, wow, how amazing. And so it's very much, similar to wonder in that way, but there's more of a scale element to awe sometimes.
Well, I love, and one of the images that really resonated with me, and I think with anybody in trying to understand that, are the astronauts looking back at the Earth, right? I mean, thinking about never having had that perspective ever, right? And now they're the ones up looking down at this incredible Earth, and I thought it was so.
And their stories were really one of the things that inspired me.
I love that you looked at their writings and things. Say a little bit about that.
In what was really fascinating to me was, even before I quite had the book idea fleshed out, was I was reading these accounts of various astronauts who had gone out on these incredible missions to outer space, not knowing if they'd make it back. And they described what it was like up there, gazing back at Earth, from way up in space. And that gave me goosebumps and made me really inspired. But what was almost more mind-blowing to me was, time and time again, what seemed to happen was they came back practically as different people. That something about that experience altered who they were in this very profound way. Some of them started nonprofits. Some of them entered, deep contemplative practices. Some of them became much more spiritual. Some of them became much more eco-conscious about, how to help the environment. But almost time and time again, even though it manifested in different ways, there was these two parts of their life, before that moment and after that moment. And these profound changes really, it challenged really how I even tended to conceptualize how we change, and how therapy works, for that matter. Of, I'd always taken this idea of small incremental steps repeated over time, forming new mental habits, and that's the way we do it. And yet in awe, I became challenged in a way that I think really fascinated me, that maybe there's something in these really powerful moments that can lead to a lasting shift, that can, force us to adapt our mental structures to this point where we aren't quite the same afterwards. We don't just revert back to what we know.
Well, and there you go. There's why you came into the field to begin with. So I'm sure that's it. So you talk a lot about the implications of what these experiences can do. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about the research, specific research in a minute, but what are some of the implications for our lives that result from these experiences? I mean, you've described it generally, but sort of how would you explain that to us?
Well, it seems to have a profound impact on us in a lot of different domains, head to toe, inside and out. Psychologically speaking, these experiences of awe boost our mood. They increase our feeling of life satisfaction. But what's really amazing to me is those gains have been shown even over the course of several weeks. So they have lasting changes to how we feel, not just in the moment. They lower our stress, including, and we could circle back because it's a really fascinating series of studies, but even including post-traumatic stress symptoms. They make us feel small yet connected to something bigger than ourselves. One of the big implications to me is, if we think about what I call the 3 C's of awe. So these are 3 effects that awe has that I think not only are beneficial to us, but also help explain why it is this universal human emotion. So it's been looked at 45, 50 different countries and cultures around the world. And everybody across the board talks about these moments as being really magical and really important. But then if it's universal, it begs the question of, well, why? Why would it be part of our DNA? And it turns out that awe and these moments of awe do 3 things for us. They make us more connected to other people. So it's a very binding emotion. Even if we experience it alone, like if we are gazing up at the moon and nobody's around us, it still leads us to see ourselves much more as, connected to other human beings. It also makes us more compassionate. So it really makes us, the altruism boosts way up in people who've just experienced a sense of awe. So connection, compassion, and then the third C is curiosity. It makes us want to know what else is out there, what else sparks this interest in me. And if you think about those, it would have obviously served profound benefits for our ancestors 10, 50, 100,000 years ago, but it also helps explain why it's so important now. And it does so much to us. There's a ton of health benefits too. It reduces markers of chronic inflammation in our body, and even compared to other positive emotional states, which is, I think, an important nuance here. Compared to gratitude, compared to joy, compared to other types of emotional experiences, that awe actually has been shown to have the most potent anti-inflammatory effects over the course of several weeks after in those studies. And it does a lot on a brain-based level in terms of our default mode network, where we're just constantly daydreaming, ruminating, self-judging. That really becomes deactivated. We become much more active in areas linked with like the release of oxytocin and interpersonal bonding. So there's just a host of really cool, in my experience at least, findings when it comes to health benefits, social benefits, psychological benefits. And in the book, what I spend the first, I would say, third of the book is really doing a deep dive, hopefully not too drive away for readers that aren't in our field, but
very readable.
Good, yeah, deep dive into what does some of this research say? Like, why do these moments matter? And then the second half is really about, well, how do we get more of it in ways big and small? How do we live our life in a way that's more open to these experiences of awe and experiencing more of this wonder in our daily lives?
Well, and I think that part of the book is just so helpful, because you can't help but read the book and be thinking in your own life of those moments. I mean, it really, and I was reflecting on my first visit to Florence, Italy, which is still one of my favorite. Well, I think of it as my favorite city. I've only been there twice, but I love it. And I went in to see the David, and I was a sort of amateur art interested person, and I walked into that hall where the statue is, and I looked up, I burst into tears. I mean, I was just by myself. I was not, and I realized, and exactly when I was reading your book, I went right back to that moment, because I realized I don't even, that was through the centuries, here we are, and it just had that moment. And what you said about connection was so, I was thinking so much about that, because you just think we are a small part of this universe, and those moments help you see that. And if you see that, you see we're all connected to make the world a better place. I mean, it just, anyway, so that was just one moment I wanted to mention
and two things really resonate for me in what you're saying there. One is, and I think this is an underrated skill, if you want to think about it, for us to consider, but going and reliving past experiences of awe, remembering those moments. Not to say it's as powerful as the first time we experience it, because it doesn't have that same sense of novelty and freshness, but it actually has a lot of the same effects in our brain and in our body as when we experienced it. And I think we so often as human beings are conditioned to look for the next thing and turn the page and forget about that, stuff it in a corner and never think about it again. But if for some of these moments of awe, wherever we found them, we instead do the opposite of that and actually linger with it and reflect on it and have reminders of it and ruminate about it, and in a good way, we end up getting so much more out of that moment as had we just turned the page and never thought about it that way. And the other piece of what you said is, I think it's so easy, and I talk about this often when I'm working with clients with depression, of, it's so easy to sometimes feel small and insignificant in a negative way in the world. The world is just can be such a difficult place, frankly, and life is hard, and it's easy to fall into that trap of feeling, meaningless in that way. And I think one of the amazing things about these moments of awe is it's very much linked with gratitude in that way, where we have these experiences and we do feel small, and we do feel like, hey, we're in this vast world I'm just a speck. But you know what? That's okay. This is magical to even be a part of
Beautiful.
that in this small way.
That's a really good point. I love that, because I do think yes, it could go, well, I love the way that you talk in the book about how, these, and it's not just nature. I think that's the other thing you can sort of, we started with the nature example, but well, sort of, but it can be in any form, I think that's right. Well, let's jump in a little bit, because I'm a researcher at heart. So let's just talk a little bit about some of the research that you review, because I think it is so fascinating how they're trying to get at this concept of experiencing awe kind of in the laboratory, and really trying to understand it. How does it make us happier and healthier and more connected? And so talk a little bit about some of that research that you've reviewed so carefully in the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. There have been a lot of studies on it, and they've come at it from a lot of creative ways, because you would think to yourself, well, how would you measure something like awe? And emotions are in general, emotion research in general can be fairly difficult to measure in a quantitative way. But they've been, I think, pretty creative in some cases. So, for example, they'll do things like experiential, conditions of groups where maybe you're out whitewater rafting, or under the night sky, or gazing up at a beautiful forest, or doing it more in a lab setting where you're watching a particular video and you're that's meant to induce a feeling of awe. So they'll often have these conditions in the studies, but then taking it one step further, they'll often do more of a quantitative assessment of, well, what was the person experiencing in that moment? Because you can imagine, I'll always think about my friend who visited me from New York, and I live not too far from Muir Woods, and I'm a sucker for redwoods. To me, it's a spiritual place. It's just incredible. But I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, as you know, and my friends are mostly from there as well. We didn't grow up with redwoods. We grew up with skyscrapers and restaurants and bars open until 4 o'clock. It was not a different world. So I took my buddy who was visiting me to a walk. This was a few years ago in Muir Woods, and I was thinking, I want to show him what this whole California thing is like. And we went walking through the woods, and I would say about 15 minutes in, he turns to me and he goes, "So is there anything else to see here besides the And I was
Such a
thinking,
New Yorker comment.
I was like, well, I guess what evokes a feeling of awe in one person can pretty clearly evoke a shrug or a yawn in somebody else. So it's a very personal experience in that sense. So even if you have two people that go whitewater rafting and you're wanting to know, well, what does that do? What you want to then do on the tail end is also figure out, well, what were they experiencing in that moment? Another study that comes to mind is, they had people watching Cirque du Soleil using EEG headgear and tracking, throughout, what were they feeling? What was the emotion that was most sort of noticeable for them? Was it excitement? Was it, boredom? Not that I would imagine that. Was it awe? Was it wonder? And looking at, well, what was happening in terms of those brainwave activities based on particular emotions. So some of the studies look at it that way, where they're actually putting people in certain conditions, but then taking the second step of asking, well, what were you really feeling? Sometimes it's done more naturalistically, where you're looking more at just people go about your life for the next few weeks, and you're going to be self-reporting. How often do you experience moments that make you feel grateful, angry, sad, awe-filled, that kind of thing? So it's really been looked at through a number of different lenses, both in terms of self-report as well as some of that more, looking at nervous system reactions and cytokine changes in in terms of our inflammatory response. So, and I have a feeling they're also using virtual reality for a lot of.
I was going to say, virtual reality seems like it would be the next, definitely the next.
They've started to do that for even, simulating what it would be like to go to space, for example. And so that they definitely are creative researchers, I would say, who are looking at this because it is a tough, I would say, emotion to study in some respects. But in my journey of learning about it, I was always very impressed with their ingenuity of, well, how can you quantify this? And how do you actually...
That to me is the most exciting part about research, right? You know, operationalizing the things that we care about as psychologists, right? How do we get at those things? And when after you've looked at most of that research, there was also some functional MRI work, I think, going on that you talked about. What are the data, you know, what are the data suggesting, you know, is in this, you know, what are we learning most from this research that you...
Well, looking certainly at the functional MRI research speaks to, you know, a lot of deactivation of regions that we tend to see a lot of activity in when we're ruminating, when we're worrying, when we're sort of in our own head, so to speak. You also see some changes in the parietal lobe, which, you know, might help explain a little bit of the, you know, that helps orient us to some degree to the physical world around us. And it might help explain why a lot of these awe experiences are described almost in out-of-body terms for people, that there's this disconnect there in a sense with the physical world. And then you see a lot of activation in areas that are very, you know, pronounced when we're feeling moments of connection, of love, of congruence with people. So it's a very, you know, the release of oxytocin, as I alluded to earlier. So on a brain-based level, you're seeing quite a bit there. And then a lot of the other research is just pointing to the really amazing health and psychological benefits of these moments that, you know, even in small doses, you know, these moments can actually have lasting ripple effects and changes in terms of how we see ourselves, the world around us, other people. I mean, there's even incredible research starting to emerge. I didn't cover it too much in the book about the effects of awe on feelings of polarization. And
oh my gosh, boy, could we use that right now.
Exactly. So, you know, I think there's not, you know, I'm always careful because there's no panaceas in any of this research. But, you know, I think it is really instructive to think about, if we were to think about what are some of the main ills that we face collectively, you know, in the world today in some ways, and you'd probably come up with things like rising rates of social alienation and disconnection, rising rates of polarization, record high rates of stress and anxiety, you know, chronic health conditions, and loneliness was at record highs even before COVID. And then it's only gotten worse. And there's toxic effects, obviously, to our health and our well-being there. So, you know, in each of those areas, there's actually some pretty strong data to show that awe can at least help in each of those areas and then some, you know, helping us go from stress to more relaxed, helping us go from disconnected and lonely to more connected and belonging, you know, boosting our mood, lowering our stress and so forth.
Well, you know, it make your reporting of that makes me think about, you know, even before we, you know, whether it's a way in, even for, you know, even if, you know, until we fully understand it better, it's still a way in perhaps to a conversation. We have a question in the Q&A here that kind of gets at this perhaps, which is, how do you cultivate awe, right? So if we see now these research findings suggest it has this potentially, you know, these positive effects, how do we cultivate it? You know, sort of turning to the last part of your book a little bit.
Yeah, so you could read pages 72 through. No, I'm just kidding. But that's a good question. So yeah, I will say, you know, I cover about 65 different suggestions and visualization practices and you know, tips on how to do that. But you know, and the reason why I wanted to give such a big menu is because there's no one size fits all. So often when I'm talking to, whether it's audiences of clinicians or the public, or even working with my clients around this, one of the first things I like to do is just, let's get on the same page about what we even mean. And let's also tie the potential benefits to what you're going through right now. So I'm not just this person coming along saying, oh, you should be, you know, seek more awe in your life, when the person's coming in for depression or anxiety or stress. I like to really tie that into something really practical of, you know, this isn't the only approach we're going to take, but it's been shown to actually alleviate some of the things that you're talking about. The third thing I like to do is get a sense from the person of, well, what have been some of those moments for you? Because number one, that clues me in, maybe even if it was 20 years ago, what have been some of the parts of life that have resonated in this way for them? And secondly, as we talked about just a little while ago, it's a great opportunity for that replaying and reliving side of awe, where we can actually visualize, use the power of imagery, for example, to go back there. And then the fourth thing I would do is thinking about these different potential roadways to greater awe in our life. Thinking about what are some reasonable tasks that a person might do in the coming week. So in my book, what I do is I take about 10 different pathways towards awe. One of them is connecting more with nature, and there's 7 to 10 different suggestions of how you might do that, even in small ways. So it could be something profound like visiting a national park, but it could also be walking around your neighborhood and looking for the colors of leaves that are changing, or listening to the sound of birds. It could be something as small as that. But then there's also, the awe that we get through vastness. So reflecting on experience, parts of life that make us feel small. There's the awe that we get through tapping into knowledge that just blows our mind. Like when I learned that there are more stars out there than there are grains of sand on Earth, that's like one of those wow moments. That's crazy. Or I remember in grad school learning about how the human brain worked and being just mind blown. Or how many different systems have to work in our body just for us to have this breath, this moment right now. Or if you even look around the room, wherever you find yourself, and think about how many parts of your field of vision would be absolutely mind-blowing and futuristic to somebody 50 years ago, let alone 500 years ago, let alone 5,000 years ago, right? So there's the awe that we feel in those moments, the awe that we feel through connection with other people, the incredible gift of love and relationship that we have with people that we care about. The awe that we get through the arts and creativity, watching a great performance, listening to a beautiful piece of music, gazing in front of the David in Florence, as you experienced, Dr. O'Connor. So, I go through about 10 of these different pathways with little suggestions on each, but it's really, I think of it just as a starting point with readers, with clients, with the public when I give workshops and lectures on this, because really I think my job, how I see it when I'm talking about this topic, is to open all of our eyes that these moments matter, and they matter in ways that we never would have realized, that we can also find it all around us. And so really the key to me is to think about what are all the parts of life that I typically have blinders on, that I don't take the time to notice, but that are actually sources of wonder right under my nose. And I even think about like this morning, waking up and an alarm going off in a phone that had more computing power than the Apollo missions, just in that phone. The fact that I could walk outside or hobble because I hurt my foot, as you know, and have coffee waiting for me, right? That I can open up my computer and respond to a message from somebody across the country. We take all this for granted. But how much of life do we miss that's really magical is really one of the things I try to emphasize in the book.
No, I love that. And I think honestly for me, why am I still in a university, right? I said to somebody recently, I never left school once I started kindergarten, but part of it is, I think that sense of, every time I learn something new that one of our faculty are doing, or a student project or some incredible thing, like it just has that, it's an ongoing, for me, education has that feeling of just ongoing wonder, it's sort of things always happening. And I think you answered this. We had a question about, how to translate or foster the experience of awe within clinical work, but maybe you could just hone, you sort of got into that, but just maybe hone in a little bit more on that. I think that would be very helpful for.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. It's one of those topics that, much like a lot of positive psychology, which is where a lot of my writing and talks and focus has been on, I used to have this little nagging feeling of like, well, what happens when I bring this into the clinical realm? What happens when I teach a class on this? So at Kaiser, we started a group on well-being, and it covers 12 different topics like gratitude and self-compassion and awe and optimism, savoring beautiful moments. It's all, every week is a different skill. And I always thought to myself, well, what happens if we're working with people with a lot of trauma, a lot of stress, difficult lives, experiences of racism, and everything under the sun, because it's a very traumatized population you work with. I used to have this thought, is this going to work with them? And I've been just so blown away, honestly, of how well this works, and how refreshing I think it is, even for clients, to, just broadly speaking, to step away from the pathologizing sort of model, which I don't mean that in a bad way as it sounds. Like, I think there's incredible importance of understanding and conceptualizing things the way that we do and having treatments that work. But I also at the same time don't think it can or should be the only focus. So thinking about, strength-based approaches, and who are you at your best, and what have been some of the moments in life where you felt proud to be you, and what have been some of those moments in life that you think back on and just you get goosebumps because they were just so profound or meaningful or beautiful. People actually, in my experience, clients like those conversations much more than I had initially feared, and it's really getting to know them in this more holistic way. So it doesn't mean at all don't do the treatment as usual and all the other amazing tools and approaches. I still to this day, tend to do much of the work that I learned in grad school. But I would say, broadly speaking, it tends to go really well when I also approach things this way. But when I'm talking about awe in particular, again, what I try to do is I link whatever the person's coming to my office for, virtually speaking now, of course, to awe. So if it's somebody who's struggling with anxiety, with depression, with loneliness, with disconnection, with high stress, with trauma, to really highlight that I'm not just pulling things out of a hat, but there's actually some pretty powerful data to show that this can help you. It's not going to be the only thing that we're going to do, but it's going to be part. I invite them to explore what have been some of those experiences in life previously that gave them those feelings. I invite them to even journal over the coming week. What do you notice that maybe you wouldn't have noticed in the past, but that's actually meaningful and beautiful in that way? And then I like to just think about, with an open, which of these parts of life do you feel like you're open to exploring? Is it the more mind expanding stuff? Is it learning something new, a topic that you're interested in? Is it listening to, music that, you have gotten away from listening to, playing, doing something creative yourself, seeking something out in nature? Really thinking about those moments of connection that can give us that feeling of awe. So looking at different, or is it microscopic awe? Is it just looking for one small thing every day that those blinders normally stop us from seeing?
Yeah. I love what one thing that you mentioned in the book is about how awe is an external emotion in a way. And I think what in your discussion about, sort of using these these ideas in your therapeutic sessions as well, it's a little bit of a lot of looking in, looking down, and this is sort of it's just that a little bit of looking out, right, looking up or whatever, and it does feel like it has that almost physical kind of shift. You also alluded to something that's come up in one of the questions, so maybe you could say a little bit more about this. Is that, are there any studies that have looked at childhood experiences where we can sort of find the seeds of awe as an adult? Like, do we know anything about that piece?
Well, there's a couple of ways that I'm thinking about that question. So not so much if we're looking at, well, what sorts of experiences did a person have growing up that leads them to, maybe experience more awe through music or through the arts. And I haven't seen that link so much. But one thing I do highlight in the book that I think is, those of you who either have kids or have been around kids, that they don't need our help when it comes to finding the awe in life. If anything, it's quite the opposite. I remember a quote by Picasso that I put in my book where he says something along the lines of, all children are born artists, but the challenge is to help them remain artists as they grow up. And I think in a similar way, all children are really born awe-inspired. The fact that they can look at anything and think it's the most amazing thing in the world, yet we become so jaded, and something amazing could be in front of us, like a redwood tree, and they say, is there anything else to see here?
What do we do? Where's the bagel shop?
So I think we could definitely, take a page in terms of how do we see the world through new eyes? How do we see things fresh? I mean, if you ever just go about your life and look around as if you hadn't seen that before, it reminds me in a way of, the raisin meditation that so many of us have done at some point in training, usually when we're first learning about mindfulness. But there's something profound there of like looking at something that we look at every day, but seeing it as if we've never seen it, and imagining it, using the power of imagination with imagery and with creativity to turn this everyday experience into something really mind-blowing. So I think that's something we can actually learn from children out there, and whether it's our own or kids that we happen to interact with. Like I was recently with my niece and nephew, and wow, things that I thought were just so boring turned out to be like the most amazing, mind-blowing thing in the world. So, and it uplifts us, right? When we see somebody else.
Bubbles come to mind.
We're like, wow, that is pretty cool, actually. That is pretty remarkable. So we become less jaded when we also start to think about things in that way. And I would say the interpersonal piece is really important too, with, not only when we see other people experiencing awe, or when we reflect on our own connections, but also just like the people that inspire us can be a great avenue towards awe. And if you think about the past year, there's been so much pain and hardship and sorrow, and there's also been probably more than we ever imagined, like stories of courage and inspiration. And whether it's healthcare workers that have been there throughout all of this, whether it's people fighting for a more just and equitable world, whether it's the people that created these vaccines in record time that are just, it's mind-blowing. So when we also get in touch with that, and we read about, learn about, experience people that uplift us, that inspire us, that too is a wonderful way to tap into the power of awe in our lives.
Well, I don't not to get off all the positive talk, but you also talk about how awe can be connected to profoundly negative experiences. Yeah. So and it made me wonder: is there a connection between awe and PTSD, or do we what do we know about that side of the equation?
Yeah, good question. So I do cover a whole chapter on this, because it's if we think back to that definition of awe, that we encounter something that's bigger than ourselves, and that makes us sort of reevaluate what we thought we knew about the world. You can imagine that definition could apply to things that are not entirely positive, or can be actually outright negative. So it should be noted that I think in surveys around 15% to 20% of people's self-reported moments of awe are actually negative. And you can think about what some of those could be. I was at Glacier National Park 2 summers ago, and was hiking, and the group that I was with was charged at by a huge grizzly bear coming full speed down a hill. And it maybe 10 feet away, ran about 200 feet in like blink of an eye. It just abruptly stopped and went back up the hill. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. It was just protecting its mom.
I practically had one reading it. So.
It was just being a good mom, but I didn't know that at the time. And I was that was awe-inspiring. Like, how could this thing that weighs 1,000 pounds practically run faster than a horse, and with that power and that fury and all that? But I wouldn't want to repeat that, even if it was an awe-inspiring moment. Or you could think even on a more tragic level, 9/11, the Challenger explosion, natural disasters, some of the fires that we've unfortunately faced in recent years. I mean, there's a element of awe to these. So when you look at the research of, well, what do those moments do to us? First and foremost, it doesn't have all those benefits that I talked about in terms of, it makes our mood better and it decreases inflammation. You could throw most of those out when it comes to negative awe. Those are really, I'm speaking more to positive awe, but it does 2 things for us that I think are really, fascinating. One is that even those negative awe moments bring us closer together with other people. So it still has that binding effect. And it also makes people kinder and more compassionate towards each other. And if you think about how, and obviously these are broad group samples, you're not, there are some people who react to tragedy and horror in really negative, self-centered ways, but more often than not, what you see is people responding in ways that are altruistic, pro-social, even in those difficult times. And it reminds me of that Mr. Rogers quote about looking for the helpers, when bad things are happening. And I think even in these negative awe moments, it can still bring us together and make us kinder and more concerned with the welfare of others than we would have been otherwise. Second piece you mentioned was around trauma. And there was a couple of studies done looking at this, but I think my favorite one was they took a group of people struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, and instead of giving them, what we would normally think of as, let's do cognitive processing therapy or prolonged exposure, any of that, they said, well, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to go to an immersive nature experience. We're going to sleep under the stars. We're going to go whitewater rafting. We're going to climb to the highest mountains and all this stuff in like some of the beautiful national parks. And then we're going to look at right at follow-up, but also at several months later, what did this do to their not only overall stress and mood, but even their post-traumatic stress symptoms. And they found that not only do these participants, by and large, report feeling better overall, more hopeful, more optimistic, but even their post-traumatic stress symptoms had decreased. This is not a PSA for don't do other treatments, take the patient out to the park. But I do think it's useful for us as clinicians and as psychologists to be thinking about treatment might look different for different people. And I think we sometimes think of it in too narrow of a term, that it has to look like X number of sessions in this particular space through a certain medium. And that's all great, but there are people out there that I think probably the most therapeutic thing for them to do is, join a social club or, play sports or, travel more. I mean, obviously there's exceptions if you're talking about like really severe psychopathology, but like, I think the message I take from that is we just want to broaden this a bit and think about, in addition to all the great treatment that we do as psychologists and in this work, maybe there's also something more that we can incorporate when it comes to these other parts of life that we as a field so often have maybe missed.
Oh, I love that. We have a question kind of follows on that, which is follows on the question about the research overall, but do awe experiences have a different impact depending on age? Like, do we know what the differences are between children, adults, or even older folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've seen some preliminary evidence around this, and it kind of has to do with, well, obviously, if we put kids in one category, because if you don't have sort of certain perspectives, certain the ability to maybe find awe in knowledge, they're very good at experiencing awe in the physical world, for example, but you wouldn't expect them to like learn about quantum physics and experience a sense of awe there. What I have seen is that, certain times, things that are loan themselves to perspective as we get older, the awe that we get through the passage of time, and just the ability, like the timelessness of, wow, visiting a place that I went to 50 years ago and feeling this incredible like flashbulb memory of, wow, how amazing to be me, but every cell in my body is different than the cell back then, and yet it's still me, and how amazing this journey of life is. That is something that you get more of that cognitive, if you want to call it that, awe is something that we tend to get more of through perspective and time. But it's definitely a very interesting area that I hope people look more at, for sure. When I do Awestruck 2.0 after.
There you go. Well, and I think it's so fascinating how many, we have so many centenarians, right? 100-year, I keep seeing these people being interviewed, or 104, or 105,
Yeah.
And I think that it would be very interesting to just to get a hold of a sample of those folks and really have this conversation. I think that would be great. So there's some research for some students to do. Here we go.
Could be some great dissertations with all, right?
Exactly. That's what I was just thinking. So let's, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if anybody else has questions, put them in the chat. But I want to just ask you to kind of, sum up in a way, the three key things you'd like readers to take away from your wonderful book. Let's put that up.
Thank you. I would say the three things.
But you can pick a number. It can be
Or how
different.
I would say one thing would just be that, these moments that can feel really fleeting and can feel really, like rare, are actually really, really important. And so we're not, obviously all the research is covered much more in the book, but the first thing I would leave people with is really just this appreciation that these moments matter, and they matter in ways that we are only starting to scratch the surface of. So when you experience those moments that give you goosebumps, that make you feel small yet connected to something bigger, to savor that, to soak it up, and to realize that you're actually experiencing something really important that has a lot of benefits to us in all different parts of our lives. So number one would just be that these moments matter. I think the second thing I would really encourage us to think about is that we don't have to look just for the big stuff. I think it's tempting to think of awe as meaning, well, I have to go out and, go to the top of Half Dome. And, I think just as important is seeking out those parts of life that we normally take for granted. And, maybe walking outside when you get a chance and just looking around and saying, well, what do I even see? That's actually pretty mind-blowing if I think about it. This tree that I walked by 1,000 times, how long has it been here? And what goes into a tree actually growing to that size? And how does photosynthesis work? Because I haven't thought about it since I was a kid in school and having to learn about it. Your mind can go to tons of different places. So I think just looking for the small parts of life that we don't normally take the time to notice. And then I would say the third thing that comes to mind for me is just that and because I'm speaking here to mostly clinicians or future clinicians, is just that, I think even if this is not a traditional, EBP that we would learn about in school, to be open to incorporating things that have really good evidence that don't necessarily fit in that box, and to be creative with approaches like this, and to think that, hey, even if I'm doing a whole other approach with this client, are there ways to maybe spark that sense of wonder in them? Are there conversations that I could have to at least open that possibility within them, that they could find more of this in life and experience just a little bit more wonder in their day-to-day? So those.
Well, and I think one of what I would love to emphasize about that is what you did in your book so effectively is you look at research that really wasn't designed for clinical. Right, the research wasn't necessarily designed to answer the clinical question, but it has tremendous implications for the clinical work. So I think sometimes we look narrowly in the literature, how do I solve this problem, as opposed to thinking that there's a lot of research in our fields that are, that might be relevant in some way. But the key is, what we want people to worry about is that there is an evidence base to the work, maybe not necessarily so narrowly. But actually, that leads me to question I really want to ask you about. So I'm going to shift your hat a little bit, since you're also a training director. And we are very grateful for that, and very happy to see our alums move into these incredible positions. And you oversee training at Kaiser, 20 medical centers. You have about, I think, 240 trainees that,
The assistant regional director for mental health training at Kaiser. And we have had such wonderful experiences with our PAU trainees coming through our internship and practicum programs. You make our life very easy.
Well, I didn't pay him to say that, but I'll take it. We have amazing students and faculty, of course. But actually, since now in your training director hat, as opposed to your author hat, what advice do you have for those of us who train current students about ways that we could adapt or update our training, or bring a focus on awe to the forefront, whether it's on the clinical side or in some other way? How would you advise us to think about this in our we're in the strategic planning process.
Good. Yeah. I think it's a good question. I think what you said earlier about teaching more how to think as opposed to what to think, in a sense, is really what it's about, because there are going to be these, in any part of clinical work, obviously, and that's my world, these nuances where you can't just 100% say, hey, this patient is exactly what I read about in this textbook. There's always going to be, how do we be evidence informed, but also flexible in our approaches? And I think that PAU does such an incredible job of training people to think like that. I would say when I was in grad school, so I was class of 2010, I was doing my dissertation on positive psychology around 2007, 8, 9, in that range. Any of these sort of strength-based approaches, positive psychology approaches, was really not at all there at the time. It was like I was this weird student that wanted to, and I want a big shout out. I don't know if he remembers me, but years back, Dr. Cordova agreed to take over some of my, he was like a chair for my dissertation because he was looking at post-traumatic growth, and I was talking about positive psychology. And at the time, that was literally as close of a connection as existed. I was like, oh, that's kind of in the same universe. But it's actually been really heartening to see a lot of approaches like compassion-focused therapy and others start to be showing up in not only the education, but also in the training, like at Gronowski and all of that. So I would really say, just continuing to be open to things that are evidence-based, scientifically driven, but that don't necessarily fit in the traditional medical model, and just the traditional way of identifying psychopathology and undoing the bad, but also looking at how do we boost well-being, how do we see people at their best, how do we what does life look like for this person at a +5, not just at a baseline, but what gets them beyond that. So maybe that's, I don't know if that's formal things that would have to be taught, or more just continuing to reinforce that ethos of possibility and optimism in that way. But honestly, I think if I could have all of our positions filled by PAU, I think we would get pretty good. So I don't know if I'm
doing our best. We're doing our best.
Don't record that, but no, we've had such a great experience. So keep doing what you're doing is really my moral of the story for sure.
No, I appreciate that. And I can, say right back at you, please keep doing what you're doing, because I think the fact that you bring this perspective and you have influence over trainees and are thinking about their curriculum and their training beyond us, so you're the next phase in their careers. And so I think it's a wonderful match for what we need for our students and our grads and our alums. So I am absolutely so filled with gratitude and sense of awe that we have had this had this chance to talk with you about this wonderful book. Any next projects we should know about, or should we? Are we doing Awestruck 2, or what are we?
Well, maybe someday. I'm looking at. I'm considering working on something that would be, especially just given how much people have been through over the past year in so many different ways. Something that focuses on very bite-sized, manageable, daily practices for well-being, that in the midst of our busy lives, people can turn to tap into resilience, to bounce back from some of the struggles. So it's starting to come into focus. It's not quite at, ready to be quite formulated, but that's kind of the general area that I think I'm going to be moving towards.
Well, will you promise to come back and talk to us about it once you have it finalized? Some
of my absolute favorite memories were in my years at PAU as a student, and I see a familiar name in the chat, Anna Castrillo. So good to.
Oh my gosh! Anna, speaking of awe, Anna is. We're all in awe when we get to work with Anna.
Absolutely. So that makes my day to see you there. Good to see you. But no, seriously, thank you. I'd be happy to, and if and when that I get around to writing that. But either way, I really had a blast today. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Jonah Paquette, talking to us today about his wonderful book, Awestruck. I highly recommend it. It will make you feel good, and you'll learn a lot from it as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.